Yeah, so far it's just us, and as you mentioned today, we'll be discussing South Africa's growth prospects, especially for entrepreneurs. At some point, I think everyone else will probably join closer to seven.
Okay.
So if you don't mind if we just continue the conversation so long, is that fine?
It's all right. Well, I don't know how well I can speak to it, but I think I'll be okay.
Sure. And then Ayabonga was supposed to join us, but yeah, he wasn't able to make it.
Okay, sure.
So cool. Yeah. So just an interesting statistic about what South Africa's future might look like. Uh, so there is potential for South Africa to increase our GDP growth by 1.1 percentage points per year,
Sure.
adding about 1 trillion rand to annual GDP by 2030, creating 3.4 million new jobs. And
Sure.
most of these jobs would be in basically five sectors. So advanced manufacturing, infrastructure productivity, natural gas, service exports, and agricultural exports.
Sure.
So my goal for today really is to answer five big questions amongst us in the group, which is, okay, what are the top, three or four initiatives that South Africa can follow to catalyze growth to say 2030? Um, but also, what are the top two or three growth scenarios that we should look out for? And then, which industries, both old and new, are likely to benefit from these different growth scenarios? And then naturally that would affect us as entrepreneurs as well. And then how much of this growth would come from, intra-economic trade with various countries in Africa? And then of course, how do we as entrepreneurs best position ourselves to take advantage of this growth? So
Okay.
I guess an interesting question is, these are the big five questions for me. Are there are there big broad questions that you and Keisha were thinking about? I'll start with you, Bandile, in case you do have something.
Sure. So one big uh, question for me has to do with, um, of course, my bias is obviously the social bias. So looking at, what do we do to make sure that we balance this potential growth with equality, with reducing inequality, um, and I sort of a big thing is looking at South Africa's place geopolitically, right? If the biggest growth trends might be, or potential growth trends would be the rise of well, the positive effects of the rise of China. Even though China is slowing down, the Southeast Asia region is still expected to increase consumption. What, sort of growth, how do we leverage towards that growth, or how do we position ourselves if we look at the global context? Um, that's maybe question two. Question three, again, is the same question of how is South Africa's growth scenario related to especially the biggest African trend? And I think we've discussed this in previous webinars. What is the link between South Africa's growth and the biggest trend on the continent, which is, the high numbers of young people that the continent will have in the next coming decades?
So I didn't get that about the young people.
So if we say, so following on last week's question, or a couple of weeks ago's, the biggest trends in Africa, then we asked the further question, how is South Africa posed to be able to grow in the context of African growth? Because, if I give a sort of preliminary answer in one line, it's something like, you know, African countries are also trying to catch up in the way we're catching up, and we will, our growth strategy is to grow, further into the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. but they're looking to grow as well and to feed global markets. So will there be tensions there, and how will we, as the more mature economy, how ought we to manage those tensions? So it's a very technical question, but I think it's very, yeah, it raises those inherent tensions about everyone's trying to grow in a damp environment, in an environment where the US won't be able to support or drive growth anymore. Europe is also in slight decline, if not stagnation. So, developing countries, what do they do?
I see. Okay. Cool. Thank you. Just quickly taking down some notes. I'm going to ask you to just remember this one because it's a bit of a longer point. Cool. Does anybody else have, big, broad questions that you have about South Africa's economic growth? And I'm going to ask us to please keep it brief and maybe just one big question from each person. So I'm going to give us a few seconds. Keisha. You can go ahead, Keisha.
Hi, guys. So I think my one fundamental question that, raised from the previous discussion we had as well is, are we willing to redefine what growth means as South Africans? And are there schools of thoughts, or are there experts, or are there people out there that have redefined what growth really means for us? Right, and then, so as Bandile said, one, do we have a view of what growth really truly is for South Africa? And two, do we understand what growth looks like in the broader context of growing in parallel with other countries in the global network?
Cool, thank you. Any other thoughts from Nkgopoleng?
Okay.
You can go ahead, Nkgopoleng.
No, my hand wasn't up. Sorry, I literally just got here, so I'm not really sure where we are. Sorry.
Oh, sure. Just to give you a quick overview. So we're just listing some of the big questions that we have about South Africa's growth. So examples are, what are the top, 2 or 3 industries that are going to benefit from this growth? As Keisha said, how do we even define what this growth is? And then what Keisha and Bandile both touched on, which is, what does this growth mean while other countries in Africa are also trying to grow, but also a lot of our business partners in the West are experiencing slow economic growth. So, how is this going to affect all of us?
Yeah, I think for me the question is, where is growth coming from, right? So I think we saw today with the GDP numbers coming through that, for example, mining sector, that's a dying sector. It's probably not going to exist in 50 years. Manufacturing, it's a little bit debatable, like with 3D and all of that and new technologies, you sort of have to ask what that's going to look like. And then things like financial services, you're also seeing contraction. So I don't know, I'm just like, what is this? Yeah, where's it coming from?
Cool, that's a good one. So I think, in fact, that's a great question to start with. In fact, I'm gonna go ahead and dive right in, and then I think at some point we'll take a check-in to figure out if the most important questions are being answered. So I think it's a good time to tackle the question of where is this growth going to come from. Give me a quick second. I'm just scrolling down to some interesting pieces of info. Cool. So I think one important element, or sorry, rather one important sector where some of this growth is going to come from is, well, advanced manufacturing. So so by 2030, exports of different products in the advanced manufacturing sector could triple to more than 700 billion rand. And 250 billion rand of this opportunity will come from the market for machinery, equipment, and appliances. 230 billion rand will come from the motor vehicle and transportation and equipment industry. And then another 220 billion rand will come from chemicals. So, I mean, it's quite an interesting thought, just thinking about how in the last couple of decades, South Africa has built some interesting manufacturing capabilities. So as you know, in Kimberley, we started building vehicles such as Mercedes-Benz, etc. I think it's Mercedes or BMW, so you'll just have to correct me if I'm wrong. And in Pretoria as well, we've got some vehicle manufacturing going on. So I think there's a lot of potential. So before I move on to the next industry, what are your thoughts about advanced manufacturing in South Africa? I'll tell you just one of my big questions is to really boost our advanced manufacturing capability. One of the important things we'll need to do is create more manufacturing clusters. And I guess my big worry is, you know, can the government be much more intentional about its planning to enable more businesses to create this cluster to make us much more efficient? Any hands? You can go ahead, Bandile.
Yeah, so my understanding of the manufacturing sector in South Africa is that there is, well, if you put manufacturing and industrial development together, we do have a plan in IPAP, Industrial Policy Action Plan, to be improving our manufacturing to like special economic zones through funding this Black Industrialist program and a whole host of other things. But the problem is the advanced, right? So that would have been manufacturing that's aimed, you know, at capturing. My sense of advanced manufacturing is that it doesn't capture what we really have in excess, which is unskilled and semi-skilled labor, right? And so, as much as there can be a planning, I think the major constraint there, from my perspective, is looking at, do we have the skill level that, you know, can bring us in? We can import skills, but I don't think there'll be a huge social political appetite for that. And you know, the government does have a lot. The other big problem is that the government does have a lot of policies, but they're unable to coordinate them amongst your because you've got many economic ministries. So I think it's, though, yeah, those are the major challenges I see there. I always think that, you know, it could contribute to growth, but in my naive sense is that there'll be a challenge in getting it going, because it seems like it necessarily will only involve a small number of people in the economy, and that's probably the biggest political economy I'm questioning in South Africa, to say, before we think growth, we focus on the is it inclusive side. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So I think an interesting question with that as well would be, how do we, you know, how will technologies such as 3D printing help to decentralize manufacturing capability and power, right? Because right now a lot of manufacturing is really reliant on having, you know, organized clusters to create efficiencies. So that's going to be an interesting one. So I'm going to move on to the next big opportunity. So this one is in infrastructure. So the big opportunity here is that smarter infrastructure delivery could save us a lot of money. So it could save us up to 1.4 trillion rand over the next decade and boost annual GDP by 260 billion rand by 2030. And this, of course, is if we invest these savings in additional infrastructure, and this could also create up to 660,000 jobs. So, I mean, this one is a very big one. I think of all of these different initiatives, this is the one that I am least bullish on. And I think that's because it would require a lot of discipline from the government's end in terms of managing infrastructure projects, managing that from a planning point of view, but also from an accountability point of view. And accountability is one of our biggest issues that we have. So I'm going to take your thoughts on this, Keisha.
Yeah. Wait.
Hi, Keisha.
So I mean, I was a translate for a very long enough to realize that I don't think this trend has a lot of fallacies in it. So number one, the assumption is that the way we've been implementing infrastructure projects labor intensively is the way to go in the future, right? So we're assuming that infrastructure creates jobs. One, it doesn't create permanent jobs. It creates temporary jobs, and that's not a job. An 18-month or a one-year contract, you can't say is a job that creates growth in a country and resolves any. The second thing, though, is that I'm sure that I might be wrong, but the assumption is that the jobs that have been created, that were created in previous infrastructure projects were necessary. And I think what's happened is because infrastructure implementations and construction projects were so inefficient, they created more jobs than they ever should have. And so for us to think that infrastructure is something that will create jobs in the future is dangerous.
I mean, I think you make a very good point, right, about jobs created by infrastructure and how sustainable those jobs are. But I guess the big point that was being made with this research report was that it's not just about creating jobs, but it's actually about the amount of savings you could generate. So if we could manage our infrastructure bill as efficiently as possible, we could save 40% of the entire infrastructure bill, right? That is a lot of money that we could redeploy to other areas that need, the money, such as health and education. Any thoughts on this, Keisha?
Well, I hear you. Okay, I hear you. So I think
Sorry, you're fading away.
I can hear me.
There we go. I can hear you.
So I hear you, and if that's the basis, then saying that infrastructure as an industry or as a trend is what will create employment isn't true. Then it's what we're saying then is infrastructure as an industry could unlock capital to enable other industries to create employment or other trends to create employment.
Yeah. I think that's the big push. And this isn't just a huge issue in government. So, I mean, I noticed that when I was in consulting, private sector companies also struggle with capital productivity for big projects. So, I think it just makes sense that the government would have much bigger gains that they could implement if this was managed more effectively.
Okay.
So here's an interesting thing about the government, though. So I think the world has had a fascination with what do they call them in Asia? The East Asian tigers. So those countries that have created some interesting economic leaps by reforming government and creating a culture of excellency. I've even noticed that, in South Africa, if you're looking for talented individuals within a big pool of labor, what you do is you'd go and look for people within, the engineering field, the accounting field, actuaries. And interestingly enough, in places like Japan, etc., some of the most prestigious professionals are public servants. So how interesting is that? And, I wonder, what does South Africa need to do to get to the stage where, it's quite normal for people like us to not have to go to work at, big companies in the private sector and to go for the government instead? What would that take? if any of you have any thoughts, you can just, let's see, Khopoleng, go ahead.
Yeah, so unfortunately, because of where we are right now, the number one predictor of where talent flows, well, in South Africa anyway, and like emerging markets, it's always going to be where the money is, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you think about who the talent pool actually is in South Africa. So you've got like a lot of young black aspirational up and coming kids, so to say, who haven't had opportunities before. And so that sort of signifier of success is always going to be follow the money. So I think one thing is to say, yeah, government should actually start paying better. Although, no, now that I think about it, okay, so I do think private sector does pay a premium to what you get paid in government. Although if you compare government to other sectors, they pay a premium, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. But then at the same time, I also think that it is possibly like a prestige thing. So I don't know how many of your friends are actually proud of working for McKinsey and RMB and a Citibank or whatever, versus someone who's like, oh, actually I'm in public service. So one of the things that we could do is what some other countries are doing. I'm not quite sure how effective this is, though, in terms of actually setting up programs where kids actually have an opportunity to go through like maybe a 6 months to 18-month program where they're working in government and they're seeing all the different ways in which they can fit in, all the different ways in which they could potentially like make a difference or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think in addition to that, what they could do as well to create a culture of excellence. I know in Japan, people write like, exams, these very tough exams to get into government, right? Which I found very interesting. So in my previous job, I met some people from the East who, and the one guy was very proud. He's like, yeah, I'm a certified public servant. I'm like, certified? So that's an interesting opportunity as well. Khopoleng, you can go ahead, and then I'll jump to Bandile.
Sorry, my hand just stayed up.
Oh, sure. Let's see. Bandile, can go ahead.
Yeah. So I think, sorry to backtrack. On the infrastructure sort of point, I was just going to say, I think part of what this report we're discussing was saying is that it's not just the building of infrastructure, but how well we put infrastructure to use. And I think there is so in addition to what you're saying about the savings we make from building it, there is as I think quite some importance to making sure that we're using it to facilitate like sort of regional trade. We're using it to that there aren't aspects of our infrastructure that are lying fallow, so not lying fallow, but rather are underutilized. And I think that's perhaps the bigger point about saying that we've got the infrastructure from mining, we've got the infrastructure in terms of roads and all this sort of thing, but it's not part of a coordinated production plan where where maybe we're more export orientated or we're building things that the world needs. The other big thing on infrastructure, I would say, is I've just noted in our conversation we're thinking about huge mega projects, so sort of very 20th century industrialization, Ford type of industrialization, where perhaps we need a rethink in that sort of field. There's some development economists who only look to the past and how industrialization happened from the 1800s onwards into the Asian tigers, where growth was driven by you build big factories. And maybe in a modern economy, maybe that's something to think about, to say, well, do you have smaller nodes and do you do things on a slightly smaller scale? And then on this point that you're making on public service, I think, yeah, for me, I often, as a rule, I don't like sort of references to culture as you know, things that explain economic behavior. But there's something about how there needs to be that huge concerted efforts and a cultural shift with regards to the attitudes, right? So I was very hopeful when I started hearing, so civil service, the first thing that comes to mind for me is education. I was really hopeful when I started to hear more about, you know, sort of private, you know, low-cost private schools, although I'm very wary about privatized things, low-cost private schools, and how we can redirect some of our talent pools to say people wouldn't become teachers or whatever because of the poor condition of our schools. But if you say, well, look, that middle, that sort of model, education model that does strive for excellence and is well run might attract someone with a university degree or a graduate to be like, okay, well, it's a low-cost private school. I am then touching, you know, the most important parts, sections of our population and contributing to those sections of our population. And you have that balance between saying, you know, if it's well run, I can get paid well enough, but also I'm doing my duty to society. So yeah, is sort of one thing I thought I had.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very interesting one about low-cost private schools. I think that's a very big opportunity. But then again, I guess the big question will be how to deploy all that amazing talent that will come from low-cost private schools and make sure it doesn't just go to the usual, right? You know, big global private sector companies. I think those jobs are relevant, but I think there's so many other places we could deploy talent. Hopeleng, you can go ahead. Hopeleng, did you have a thought for us?
Oh, sorry. I thought I unmuted, so I started rambling. I was going to say, does it really work, though? Because you are now going from a two-tier system that does not work to now a three-tiered system, in the sense that you know that those low-cost private schools aren't enough to necessarily service everyone who needs education in the country. So that means that you've got obviously the elite who go to the private schools and get really good education, and then maybe you get like another 20% or 20 to 30% going through this other route. Whereas maybe what you actually want to say is, well, you know, you should have quality education for everyone, right? So if anything, that actually makes the process take longer, because now instead of putting all your efforts and your funds and resources into building what we already have and making that strong and better, you're actually diverting these resources, because maybe university students, because of unemployment, they might actually be forced to go to public schools to teach, and then through their new skills, resolution, blah, 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 actually make that better. But now they have this other way to make money, so then they end up going that way. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I think, I guess the challenge is the government needs to be a bit more intentional about creating, you know, a larger system that will give everybody, you know, good quality education, because what's happening now is the private sector is taking advantage of this big gap. Not always just for monetary reasons. I think a lot of people genuinely are passionate, and of course they can achieve a good bottom line while doing that. But you're right, I think there's a bigger question about education that's accessible to everybody and that's of a good quality. An interesting thing about that as well is it requires, I think, potentially a massive tax base. But then again, you know, that's basically following patterns from the past. And I think with all these new technologies in place, we might not need such a massive tax base to fund education for everyone that's high quality. You can go ahead and Hopeleng.
Yeah, but also, yeah, look at Kuro. Isn't their biggest shareholder now PSG? I might be wrong. Um,
Yeah,
but the
they are
whole
significant.
point,
Yeah,
yeah, and then the rest of it, obviously, I think it is listed. It is, hey? So
yeah.
that
Last I
means
checked,
that
it
there's
was
like
listed.
people actually owning, which is actually very scary if you think about it, because that means that your priority now goes from what is good for the kids and education to literally making sure that the shareholders are happy, because essentially that is, that's where your backing's coming from. So actually, it is, at the end of the day, it ends up being just like any other private school.
Yeah, and to your point, I think what makes your point powerful is we've seen some of these scary things happening in the private sector for health. Um, that, incentives just mean that people are incentivized to maximize the bottom line and not necessarily to serve the lowest common denominator. So that's a very important point. Cool. So I'm thinking I'm going to jump on to the next section. Oh, just one more thing I wanted to mention about infrastructure is, natural gas as an opportunity to power South Africa's future. So South Africa could gain roughly 20 gigawatts of gas-fired power generation capacity by 2030, and this could provide flexibility to at least 10 gigawatts worth of renewable energy capacity. Um, Sorry, these metrics aren't really as familiar to me, so I'm just going to read them as is. So this would create demand for 1 trillion cubic feet of gas annually, so similar to Malaysia's demand. And this alone could add 140 billion rand to South Africa's GDP, depending on whether the price levels become favorable. And it could also add up to 230,000 jobs. So even though South Africa's shale gas resources are yet to be proven, they could still create an additional 40,000 to 102,000 jobs. So what are your thoughts on gas and South Africa's electricity challenges? So Bandile, you've had your hand up for a while. You can go ahead.
Yeah, reading this, I think there is a good potential for growth. Um, I think sort of the natural gas sphere is something that's still prevalent. I was surprised to read. It's still prevalent in quite a number of other countries. But the big challenge with this then is, do we have widespread? So my understanding is that you take the natural gas and you convert that into power, and then so I'm like, do we have the capacity for that? What would it take to build that capacity? And then who would run it, right? So my big thing again is, as much as I my natural instinct is against a lot of privatization. I think there's decentralization that's important when you talk about the whole of the electricity production in South Africa. Having the one big controller, and then again having them in such institutional disarray means that I think there's a huge step where we need to consider how we're diversifying our sources of power in South Africa at all levels. So sort of power generation, but also the sort of products and do we build things that run on solar, right? In order to help, there's one conversation about growing solar and growing these renewable forms of energy, but are we also having the more downstream conversation about making more things that run on these renewable types of energy?
That's a good point. Okay. Cool.
Maybe
Just sorry?
I'd want to hear Kahisha's view on this one.
Kahisha. Okay, Kahisha's maybe. Bandile, do you mind just typing her a chat so that when she does get back, we just quickly get her to answer that question, eh?
Sure.
Cool. So I think maybe what we could talk about now while we wait for Kahisha is, service exports. So riding the wave of Africa's growth. So service imports by Sub-Saharan Africa grew at an average of 7.1% from 2002 to 2012, reaching 536 billion rand. And the greatest value came from transportation, construction, business and financial services. But South African exports only account for 2% of the region's service imports. By contrast, Brazil owns a much bigger share of its region's exports. So it basically commands a 26% market share in providing service imports to Latin America. I think before we chat about service imports, Keisha's got her hand up. Can go ahead, Keisha.
There was a question you wanted me to answer.
Yeah, Bandile, do you mind just quickly sharing your question?
Hello?
Hey, Bandile, do you mind just reading out your question to Kahisha?
Yeah, so I just wanted to know what your thoughts on the natural gas thing were, but also more generally on how we generate power in South Africa. Is it a good thing that we ought to diversify our energy sources like solar and natural gas? But who would be running it, right? So my thoughts was that decentralizing is a good thing, but there are the potential risks, political and socioeconomic risks of privatization. So what's the best strategy there? And then lastly, more downstream. So we can produce all these different forms of power, but do we actually produce items that run on these forms of power? So we can produce all the solar in the world, but do we actually produce items that run on solar? And what's the prospects of that?
So I know everyone's vouching for a green economy and sustainable development. But unfortunately, I think in the context of South Africa, in the context of creating jobs, and in the context of creating industries that are labor intensive still with a low skilled labor force, I still believe in the traditional coal industry. And I think what needs to happen is we're not producing electricity efficiently. And that comes through, investing more in research and development, so that, we improve the way we operate. And I think privatization can be of two things, right? So there can be the privatization at asset level, which I don't think is right. So I agree with, for instance, Eskom keeping ownership of its power stations. But you could look at outsourcing models such as, the maintenance of those power stations could be private maintenance companies. The distributors and the payment systems, okay, not a SASAC scandal, but payment systems and all the things that are not, asset heavy, but are more services in enabling these, in operationalizing these assets, those could be privatized, because it's been proven that the private sector, unfortunately, is just always going to be more efficient until, we fix ourselves at the public sector. So, and the idea, I think, behind coal, and yes, it's running out in Mpumalanga in the next 40 years, but there's coal in Botswana, there's coal in other regions. And I think to develop Southern Africa and to develop Africa, there is still coal sources and resources underground. And I think it would be unfair and almost a disadvantage and almost cheating Africa of its resources and the power it has and its wealth if we were to bypass, developing the coal sector and allowing other economies to exist in the coal economy and going straight to a green economy that the developed world is trying to get into.
Yeah, I think it's easier to leapfrog previous development patterns in some contexts, and then others it's a bit more difficult. So I guess with telecommunications, it's a little easier than I guess with power generation.
Yeah.
Cool. Hopeling's got a thought. Kopeling, you can go ahead.
This might sound like a very stupid question, but it's very sincere. So do you guys think that there's like morality that needs to be considered with regards to the environment, or what are your thoughts on that? Like, is it moral to harm the environment when you know that you are harming it, like deliberately? You know, so there was a point in time where we could argue that, I don't know, yeah. What do you think?
I mean, my quick thoughts on this is, I'm not able to comment on any morality per se. I don't even think that morality exists, but I think in terms of sustainability of the planet and the human race, we've got to start doing things very differently. Otherwise, we're going to have a very big problem. And I think different regions across the world are already experiencing some of these issues. Kehisha? Hey, Kehisha?
Yeah, you unmuted me. You want me to say something about
Oh, sorry, your hand is up.
Oh no, sorry. I just didn't put it down.
Oh, cool. Any thoughts on Nkopeleng's important question? It's very relevant, I think, as well. It also helps us answer the question of, are we defining growth in new ways that are more suitable for the local context, but also I think for the broader context, which includes the environment. So are there new ways to measure growth? And I think, Nkopeleng, what are your thoughts on redefining what growth means, especially in relation to environmental impact?
Okay, so I won't answer the redefining growth question just yet, but I think the reason why I asked the question that I just asked now is that if you look at the stats, environmental impact, it's always the poorest people in the world who get hit the hardest, right? Either because it's much easier for people with resources to divert them when they are scarce, or for example, where those what do I call it? Like poorer communities tend to find themselves in terms of like where they live, the land that they occupy, what they can do with that land, and all of that, always sort of being pushed out to the margin to the worse off areas. So I know I'm not articulating this properly, but there's very like clear, concrete evidence out there. I think Naomi Klein does quite a lot of work in that regard, where they show a clear correlation between sort of how, like climate change and who are the people who are actually, like bearing the costs of climate change. It's not people in the developed world. And even within the developed world, it's always the people on the margin or the people who are like right at the bottom of the pyramid. So in a way, to me, it's like you taking small gains, i.e. employment, which is obviously very important, but at the same time, you disadvantaging a whole bunch of other people, possibly killing a whole bunch of people. I don't know.
Yeah, you're right. So Naomi Klein has done some fantastic research on this point. And I think we've seen some very devastating effects on lower income families in South America. So there's a lot of research and documentaries on what happened there. And sometimes it could be, I guess some of the most famous offenders was, the United Fruits Company in South America, and I guess a lot of what those companies did was, in a way, a new form of colonization, right? And to think that, I guess if you're sitting in a developed country and you're eating bananas and you don't know what goes on, or I guess all the effects that were imposed on other people to extract some of these products. And then, of course, in Africa, there's a lot that's been explored on this topic. Ken Saro-Wiwa as well was an activist in this regard. So you're right. In fact, I think we don't even need, in theory, we wouldn't even need the research, because I think the harm is, well, at least to me, seems self-evident. It's something we can't ignore. I do think there are two challenges in this regard, which is one, in the context of globalization, how do local governments deal with other governments as well as global companies that come into the local space and make sure that people are accountable? And then the second thing is, in terms of our changing development patterns, how do we as a society play quote and unquote catch up, right, with developed countries, building power plants, etc., while at the same time finding a new way to develop our country and ourselves without harming the environment. So I think it's so complex and multi-layered. It's a very difficult one. It's a very difficult question. Any thoughts before I move on this topic?
Just to add to that quickly, it's almost as if when we talk about like the economy and what growth means and all of that, it's almost as if you need very thoughtful people from every sector possible, right? People who know their respective sectors really, really well. Like even things that you wouldn't think about, like maybe humanities or philosophy or engineers and this and this and that. And from all of those different thoughts, then you can start to create a model that is holistic and doesn't miss anything, or maybe misses a few things versus what we have now. So I think the problem, though, is that right now when we think about the economy, it's always like the finance people, right? Or people in government or the economists or whatever. Whereas really what you need is this huge, thoughtful global debate where everyone's like, oh, okay, so this is how this would affect people in this way.
Yeah, you're right. And just some quick thoughts on this is, I mean, my hope is that in the future, more and more aspects of the economy will become decentralized over time. And for me, I guess my great example is, yes, internet services are, quite centralized with, the telecommunication companies. But I guess the different types of services that are created as a result of ISPs are so many because, the internet is decentralized in a certain sense. And when you look at how the internet to a certain extent is self-governed in a way. So I think as more and more there's more and more technological development and 3D printing. I don't know how, but I just hope that even government itself can become decentralized to a certain extent, so that we as the people can make decisions for ourselves and effect change the way that we want to. Bandile?
Yeah, I think I fully agree with this notion that it does take an understanding from different approaches. It must be more multidisciplinarian. At a very macro scale, I remember watching like a video on I think it was Crash Course World History, dealing with this question about, okay, how do we think about growth and how do you think about the future? And what it does require on a large scale, I think, is for those who are opinion makers and creators of culture to be positioned, very strategically to simply change the world's consumption patterns. I think we're at the stage where the only thing that can save us is some rapid change in technology that makes us more efficiently use our resources, or some rapid change in culture. And for me, that's a really fascinating project, especially to come from people who are multidisciplinary, right? So I'd prefer someone who had, you know, that mix, who had studied a lot of those things and knows how to synthesize them, to be like, well, how do you massively change the consumption patterns in the world using culture, modern culture, traditional culture, all this sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting because I mean, I think it still leads, well, at least for me, it leads back to how do you decentralize decision making to a certain extent? Because as long as its decision making is and power is concentrated in the hands of, you know, a select few, then it means that all the decision making patterns are going to reflect, you know, who's in the room. So that's going to be an interesting challenge. So I wanted to quickly then move on to the opportunity regarding service exports and South Africa's potential to become, you know, a much bigger player or gain much more market share in exporting services to the rest of Africa. What are your thoughts on that? And maybe this one is from Khopoleng. I wanted to just quickly get, there's some interesting statistics about financial services and, oh, so there are exciting opportunities in corporate and investment banking that could be worth 320 billion rand by 2030 should South African banks increase their market share in sub-Saharan Africa from 12 to 20% in 2030. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's so hilarious because, despite the fact that I work for a bank, I actually think banks are evil and they shouldn't exist.
I know, I was being ironic. I was actually teasing.
If we are rethinking growth and development and like all of these things and we're starting from the bottom, I don't want to see investment banks in Africa. We need new models. I don't know. I don't know. What do you guys think? What do you think, Bandile?
Well, maybe just to that point, Khopoleng, because you're right about investment banks and I guess the role that they play, which can be very good but very potentially very negative, right? What about investment banking driven by government? So if you look at the African Development Bank, do you think there's a big opportunity there?
I think the problem is that like the whole capital market system, it's intrinsically elitist, right? And so if you're talking about inclusive growth, for me, it's not even in the picture, because if you think about it, first of all, when you say, well, what are we actually creating, right? So you open up you export services, you open up a couple of banks in Kenya or Ethiopia or whatever. Firstly, the reason why they would go there is to extract value as opposed to create value. So they go in there because they know that there's some profits to be honed or whatever. But then at the same thing, that's not the type of thing that's going to change an economy and change a nation, in the sense that you open up 5 investment banks and you hire, I don't know, 100 people at best. But I think what I'm more interested in, and this is going to sound really lame, but I'm interested in, I don't know, like a holistic economy that, like Bandile was saying, so you look at what our consumption patterns are, or should be rather, how we should be living as human beings, how we should be elevating ourselves in terms of like culture, the arts and all of that. And then from all of those things that we really need, that's how you create the supply. I don't know if that makes sense. So you first say, like, what do we actually need to be doing as human beings? And then the supply comes from there. But then just replicating the same models of like capital markets, securities, equities, and all of these things, and just like exporting them all over the country, I mean, all over the continent or the globe, it's basically just the same thing for me. Like you're not doing anything radical. You're just repeating a case study that you've already been through in one country in a different country. So I think this is where I find difficulty, because a lot of the times you have to be very practical in terms of what these things mean, like tomorrow, what are the policies that we could implement tomorrow. But I'm also interested in the conversation of what if you forgot everything you knew and you were to set up this new holistic, beautiful economy where like people are allowed to be human and, you know, like you're only creating what you need. And yeah, so yeah. That's my
Well,
little 2 cents.
well, it's interesting. I think to that point, from my point of view, there's a big opportunity in services to create to create services and product that are much more human like oriented. And I know this is a big buzzword. I hate to use this, but I guess there's a big, human-centered design movement. Um, and regardless of the fact that yes, it comes from the West, but I think the philosophy would have come from anywhere, which is, design products and services that are suitable for people and aren't always about creating an excess. So I guess I'm a bit more bullish on new technologies helping people to improve these types of services and create things from scratch. And if you've noticed, a lot of the big advances being made in services and in technology come from multidisciplinary teams. So I really like that point as well about getting the view of different people. Any thoughts on this? And maybe, so I'll just add, I hate bringing M-Pesa as an example. And obviously M-Pesa is operating under the current, capital markets paradigm. But I think it's an example of how to change things. In fact, please call me as well in South Africa, interesting services and products, even though they operate under the oligopoly of the big four networks. Let's see, Bandile?
Yeah, maybe repeating other thoughts, but I think, this whole thing about what we ought to be doing in Africa comes with sort of many challenges. And an interesting thought for me would be to see how these conversations are being had by the people who are posed to be the business leaders in the next 15 to 20 years, right? So perhaps you and I, but maybe not me. I'll be dodging bullets somewhere, I hope. But those people who are in these sectors who are building this sort of capacity, like leading in corporates and this sort of thing, that's an interesting question for me to be like, what is their orientation and how are they being groomed, I can say, to say, well, when we go into Africa, we don't pursue profits, we pursue, adding value to the continent and unlocking the value to the continent. And I think, that's just my thought on that.
I doubt those conversations are happening. Sorry, I was just saying, I doubt those conversations are happening in the boardrooms and whatnot. Even just in the language of, conquering Africa, it's the same story. So I'm very doubtful of whether people are sitting in boardrooms thinking about how to unlock value. It's all about essentially creating more value for themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, just speaking about, the future business leaders, and I think a lot of these people are going to come from our peer group. A lot of them are going to be people like yourselves. So, I do think that with our peer group, I do see a lot of the patterns from the past in terms of elitism and all sorts of talent. I think we're a fantastic group of people, but I do sort of worry that we have been trained in a certain system. The same system that made us very successful is also the same system that created blind spots in how we think about growth in our own communities and other parts of Africa. So I think it's going to be a big challenge for us to think about doing things in new ways. And I do see small pockets of people within our community and other communities as well thinking about new ways of doing things. But I think it's going to be a very, very interesting and big task to undo some of the thinking that we've been taught. Any thoughts on this? Okay, no hands up, so I'm going to move on to the next point. So this is about agriculture. So let's see. I just want to quickly read. So several of South Africa's existing export markets, notably sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, are growing rapidly as large populations join the consuming class, creating 145 billion rand as an opportunity. But I think capturing this potential will be very hard. It would require an integrated national agriculture plan. So what are your thoughts on agriculture as an opportunity? And also just, I know this is also going to come back to the land question as well, which is always an interesting one here in South Africa. Go ahead, Bandile.
Yeah, I'm under pressure to speak as a semi-expert, but I'm not that. So I've just started at Oxfam South Africa, and I'm in rural transformation. And looking at sort of things right now, it's so I don't know if you've heard recently, we did have a bumper crop coming up from the droughts last year, and just look, I've got the growth figures in front of me. Agriculture, forestry, and fishery is one of the positively growing sectors. It contributed 0.4% to GDP growth. So that's the one thing that's on the up and up. But I think the big challenge there is resolving the land question, but also if you look at agricultural value chain, there's a lot of interesting stuff that's happening regionally. So I think there is a positive in that sector, in that we do a lot of our regional coordination with like growing of wheat, and we grow a lot of wheat, and there's agricultural production in Zambia, and there's trade. It's one of our basically our front runners, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of inter-regional trade. So the prospects for growth, I think that's a place where Africa can make a difference, and South Africa can lend a lot of technical skill, given that our agriculture sector was so strong. The land question is, if we resolve that quickly and decisively, and set it up so that you've got that authority that's mediating between people and making sure that the most dispossessed people are actually a part of the system. I think that's a sector. The agricultural sector is one place in South Africa where there's huge potential for growth and huge potential for positive benefits. But if you cock it up, you're gonna mess it up like properly. So it's one of those very dangerous sectors.
Sorry, and when you say the land question, I guess what are the 2 or 3 things that could be done, and what are the implications? So if I'm an alien and I don't know what South Africa is like, what are the land dynamics?
So the land dynamics, I think it's the outstanding. So as things stand now, you have people who don't, the people calling for the land are, I'd say, people who are living in agricultural communities but don't participate properly in the agricultural economy. It's people who are living in informal settlements who are, given the fact that they're excluded from the formal economy and from cities, have the right, are looking back to the historical right to say, well, we were moved, or there was, land thievery in South Africa, and we've got a right as a way to this land in order to further our well-beings and our economic prosperity. And yeah, so the big backlog I'd say is a lot of government like inefficiency, right? So the government doesn't have the political will to take away land from people, because the Constitution does allow it. And they are, it seems right now, it's just a waiting game. It's a waiting game for, I'm going to see the land reform program has 3 sort of pillars. There's land restitution, land redistribution. So restitution is giving it back to your old land, like where your ancestors were. Land restitution, land redistribution, sharing it equally, like so that everyone shares in the economy. And then there's land tenure, which is saying, okay, if you're on a piece of land and you work for people, say if you're like a farm worker or whatever, are you participating properly? Are your rights being protected? And I think the whole, I'm not being very articulate now, but I think that the big thing is saying, there is, if we are climate smart, that's the one thing where South Africa does have the technical expertise. It does have the big agricultural institutions that can facilitate research and development such that we can contribute to South Africa's growth and you know, improve the already sort of promising regional links. The one thing though is, one big threat is the whole food security thing, and that's caused by a whole host of things. It's climate change. It's caused by sort of the competition for that, you know, some agricultural products that would usually go into food are now, you know, being diverted to biofuels. So just politically, the food security thing needs to be looked at, you know, very carefully. Otherwise, yeah, it's an area I think South Africa could do quite well if it's managed properly.
Okay, cool. Nkgopoleng?
Keisha, do you want to say something before I go on? I feel like I've been speaking a lot. Is she still there?
I'm still here.
Oh, are you keen to say something? I'll speak after you.
No, the land issue is, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is that it goes back to holistic thinking, because even with the land, you still have to look at the entire whole, value chain, right? Because it's not siloed. Like right now, even people who do have access to land, basically food producers and retailers as well as banks have more power than those people. So it's not only the question of, okay, we don't have land, you fight for it and then you have the land. Once you have it, you still have to deal with like zoning regulations. You have to deal with all of these regulations that won't allow you to do what you want to do with the land. Like, for example, you might have a piece of land and they're like, oh, actually, you're not allowed to farm XYZ because of whatever. And then I think it goes back to what you said, Bandile, with political will, that like, I think maybe that's where the government is getting tripped up, that like, when people say they want land, like it's not necessarily the question of like, oh, like literally this land that I'm standing on. Like it's what the land gives you, right? So it's security, it's ability to provide for yourself, it's a future. But at the same time, you have all of these policies that seem to not necessarily look at the entire process and say, well, what does this actually mean? I remember, I don't know if you were part of that debate, Bandile, when the big debate had, what was it again? I don't think it was land's food security. But they had this one discussion where basically they went across the country meeting some of these people who literally did have their own pieces of land and were trying to grow food and whatnot. but at the same time they had to worry about the fact that they didn't have access to water, for example. So that meant that they couldn't necessarily grow anything. And in good times when they did have water, they didn't have access to markets. So actually say, well, where am I going to sell these potatoes or oranges or whatever it is that I'm growing? And then there's also the question of access to labor, like people to work that land, access to capital, like you need machinery, you need money to be able to run a proper farm. So once again, like I feel like we're going to get to that point where we're fighting for the land, we actually get it, and then that ownership is actually an illusion, because at the end of the day, your retailers, your banks, and your food producers are still there, and they're still taking like a huge chunk of your profits. And so I don't think it's land as much as it is like security and a future, essentially.
Cool. Bandile?
Oh, sorry, my hand was up from earlier.
Okay. Cool, if you don't mind self-muting there. Okay, cool. So the next question is about the type of jobs that we need to seize this future. So we spoke about all these different sectors and the economic growth that they could potentially add. But also, how does this translate into jobs? So basically, this could create an additional 3.4 million jobs. So all the sectors combined, infrastructure, gas, agriculture, services, all of it combined, could create 3.4 million jobs. But that's going to be a very big challenge, just given what the workforce looks like today, right? So only 22% of these new jobs will be suitable for people with only a matric certificate, while an additional 48% of these jobs will require additional trade or clerical skills. And then the remaining 30% of these jobs will require technical, managerial, or professional skills. So, how do we create the labor base that we need to seize this future? I think, let's actually just touch on a few things, right? So there's expanding vocational training, right? So we need about 40 to 60% of South African youth that should graduate through these vocational programs by 2030 in order to take advantage of this opportunity. And in South Africa, we've got a very big problem with how we view technicons, and I think we have a bit of an obsession with universities. So there's a huge opportunity with technicons and colleges. What would it take to get us to the next level? I also think maybe on another front as well is because there's a part of the economy that's transitioning to the information age. I also think our professionals are struggling to make that transition. So how do we deal with all of this? In fact, I mean, most of you will know a lot of people in our peer group at work even struggle with things like Excel. So how do we deal with all of these pressures on the labor force? Pressures coming from both the past and the future. Go ahead, Bandile.
Yeah, so I think, it's this line of rapidly expanding vocational training. A big thing for me is about the perception of vocational training and, the legacy. So the legacy that we have in South Africa of poverty and now, people value university so much, I think, partially and maybe to a significant extent because coming from a context of poverty, you want the fastest and the highest shooting way out of poverty. And I think, what we need to do is, I think government needs to make a much more concerted branding and marketing. Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, a much more concerted branding and marketing sort of efforts that shows that there is a quick maybe pipeline from doing vocational training to entering jobs. And for me, because it's you know you get the perception to be like, where is it? Where can you? People focus on university precisely because they see people getting money from doing your 3 years maybe and getting that sort of corporate job. But if there was somewhere from a branding and marketing perspective where we could up the appeal of doing vocational jobs, I think we'd go quite a long way. But it means, for me, like the big thing is fixing your first step is fixing sort of your public enterprises and showing that if you go through this process, through government state-owned enterprises, there's a guarantee that you'd probably get a secure job, this sort of thing, or at least that these sectors that our SOEs are working in are actually generating jobs at a rapid rate.
It's very interesting. In fact, I think South Africa isn't necessarily unique in this regard, right? So I think all over the world, so just in my own personal studies of computer science, you start to notice that there's a huge difference between programming and computer science. But even in the US, for some odd reason, people are required to go and study computer science just to become programmers. But you could really see a very strong delineation between computer scientists and programmers who could really, do different types of jobs, some that are very engineering focused and some that are really just about technological artisanship in a way, right? But then, at the same time, I do think there's an opportunity to use technology itself to provide high quality education to everybody in different spaces. But the question is, do we have the right skills in government to do that? Kihisha?
So this is my view. I don't think we're being risky enough or innovative enough when we're talking about transformational agendas and we're still talking about things like, okay, let's increase the number of people who go through vocational training. Okay, let's increase the number of schools. Like, the schooling system does not work. So why would we add schools to a system that doesn't work? Universities are creating jobs that by the time you graduate, those jobs don't exist. So why are we adding universities? On the one, and we're very in conflict with like what we're stating. On the one hand, we're talking about entrepreneurship and how that's the future growth. But on the other hand, we're saying, let's create workers because workers will create growth. So I think we need to decide, like, are we creating growth that leads to jobs? And in those jobs, how do we prepare the workforce for those future jobs? And if we're creating entrepreneurs, let's be honest, the education system we have now and going to varsity or going to a vocational college, it does not create entrepreneurs more than an entrepreneur who, I don't think it's a system that's working in creating entrepreneurs, it's creating workers. So I'm trying to figure out, what agenda are we pushing? Are we pushing a growth agenda that results in job creation through entrepreneurship, or are we creating jobs for the sake of creating jobs?
An interesting point on that one is, I think the two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. I think we'll always need both entrepreneurs and professionals and, different types of people in the labor force creating value in the economy. I do think that our education system isn't supporting people to become entrepreneurs, but I don't think that that's necessarily the biggest lever. I think South Africa's particular issue with entrepreneurship is a lot of the other enablers aren't in place in terms of creating like organic business growth. And the biggest barrier, in my opinion, is less about education than it is about sexism and racism. There are a lot of very simple jobs that somebody could do that doesn't necessarily require a high education, but people are being blocked from growing their businesses simply because, people are either women or they're people of color. Go ahead, Kihisha.
Yeah. I think I'm just struggling with the notion of creating jobs for the sake of creating jobs. And creating a society that is geared towards a specific growth agenda. So yeah, I think I'm struggling with the notion of jobs as an ends and versus a means. So I feel like right now we're talking about jobs as a means and it ends in itself. Like, that's it. We need to create jobs, and the reason we need to create jobs is to have jobs, versus focusing on what will create jobs and then satisfying that demand. I feel like we need to focus more on developing demand for employment or demand for labor rather than pushing supply.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think the only challenge with that statement specifically is that economies are very complex and chaotic systems, right? So there are multiple feedback loops that feed into each other to create growth, and it's very difficult to isolate any specific feedback loop on its own. Otherwise, a business plan for the economy would be much easier to draw up. While at the same time, random events can alter smaller inputs and create outsized impact on the outputs. So whether it's an earthquake or a new type of technology. So I think yes, you're right about all of these different issues. And I think Hopeleng has also touched on, what is the right approach to growth. But the reality is, with such a complex and dynamic and chaotic system, it becomes difficult to create the right type of business model and iterate through it, because bureaucracy just means it takes humanity hundreds of years to iterate from one system to the next.
Agreed.
Yeah. Bandile, and then I'm going to go to Hopeleng. And go ahead, Bandile.
Yeah, so I think the whole issue of creating jobs is there should be a longer term sort of idea, in that we don't create jobs purely for the sake of creating jobs. We also use jobs to upskill the people who are sort of sitting at home, so the neat people not in education and employment, because what's happening is that there's these people who are out of the labor force for so long that it becomes much more difficult as time goes on to incorporate them, right? So I think there ought to be a rush on the one hand, just to put money into people's hands so they can survive, but also there's this thing of saying, as we're building towards this broader trend of the continent of saying there are going to be more people, especially younger people, it's really important to make sure that they get work experience and build skills as soon as possible, because that's the only way you capitalize on the demographic whatever it's called. And then it's a further question about saying, well, South Africa's currently strong sectors, i.e. sort of our very strong tertiary sector services don't service the rest of South Africa, right? So then there's a problem of self-sufficiency in terms of the macro economy, meaning the services we use are used by only certain parts of the country, and then we export them to the world, right? So that the areas in which we are strongest, like your services sector, don't feed back into improving the rest of the economy, so that there's multiplied growth. And so your whole focus on jobs is to make sure that, well, you boost consumption, and it's through, or rather, I mean to say, focusing on like manufacturing and making sure that those sectors, your quote unquote real economy sectors, where there's actually the making of things, that is a much better sort of mechanism to make sure that your economy the wheel of your economy turns round and round, because you're producing things, and you ought to be producing things that the rest of the world can use. So you're globally competitive, but also, it's things that your people can consume. And then through the creation, I don't know if you can see the cycle in your head. I'm busy waving with my hand, but you guys can't see me. But like that whole thing of you create sort of jobs, and that boosts consumption, but you've created your jobs through sort of manufacturing, so that those goods are then bought by your people again. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Khopoleng, do you want to say something before I jump back to Keisha?
I didn't want to be rude. I've wanted to leave for the past 5 minutes. I'm going to take this chance to say thanks and then leave.
Sure. Thank you so much, Khopoleng. Thank you for your thoughts.
Step out quickly. Thanks, guys. Ciao.
Cheers. Cool. Keisha?
No, nothing left on the job agenda.
Oh, okay. Cool. Just saw your hand up. So Bandile, if you don't mind putting down your hand, and if everyone could mute themselves again. Cool. So I guess the next question then is, how does all of this then affect how South Africa is positioned for growth relative to other countries in Africa, but also other economies that do business with South Africa that could affect, and some of these economies are going through, some are prosperous, some are going through hard times. We mentioned China. Again, how does South Africa thrive in the context of global economic competition? So I think Bandile, Keisha, I think that these were some of your big questions. Go ahead, Bandile. You can go ahead, Bandile. Okay. Any other thoughts? Bandile is not saying anything.
Hello?
Hey, Bandile.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay, I said quite a bit. Okay, but I'll start again. I'll say, part of the issue is that there needs to be this stronger global consensus on how to run the economy, right? So this creates a global coordination. I think we try to do it with like your WEF and that sort of thing, but that's a fairly elitist space, because I think where the current situation is that your biggest drivers of growth, or maybe your biggest consumers in your developed economies, those economies are slowing down, and then it's difficult for developing economies to set the agenda as to what they ought to produce and what they ought to sort of be doing to kickstart the world economy. So I don't know what it is that will kickstart the world economy, but I think one step is to get a clearer sense of which country is doing what. And so for a while, we tame down the forces of individualism, where people just produce to see what quick buck they can make. And I think there ought to be a global sort of consensus to say, we're trying to build these things here, and you do this and you do that to jumpstart the world economy. Because as things stand now, the whole globally competitive narrative, I'm sort of just reading now on something that Brand SA does, and the whole vibe from a lot of our think tanks here is that we need to be globally competitive. But there's something at a higher level, at a meta level, where we're all competing in these sort of sectors, but it means the world will be pulled towards a tech, a lot of times like a technologically based economy, and it's not clear that everyone will benefit from that. There needs to be sort of a slowing down, a thing of saying, okay, cool, competitiveness isn't shouldn't be the primary driver, because then it'll be a race to the bottom in terms of costs, and like a race for innovation, which is good. But are we at a higher level saying, okay, cool, how are we all coordinating our economy so that we're less in competition with each other and we're more complementary to each other. I think that conversation needs to happen in BRICS, and it needs to happen sort of at a broader level between developing countries and the world as a whole.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think there are basically two interesting implications of that, right? So I think number one is, I don't know if global consensus is possible in the next 50 years, even with the UN, which came from the League of Nations, right? And the League of Nations came from World War II and I, I think. So if you look at the roots of the UN itself, the foundations are, well, some interesting questions that we all have, right? So I think aiming for that in the short term is really challenging, but also I think the notion that competition is necessarily bad is something that I struggle with, because competition isn't always about outdoing the competitor, but sometimes it means competition is about who could produce whatever good or service at the right level of quality at the cheapest price, given all of their advantages in their economy. And I think it doesn't necessarily make sense, or at least at this stage of human history, to assume that each country can equally can equally produce everything at the right level of cost and efficiency and quality. Any thoughts on that?
So I'm reading 0 to 1 at the moment, and yeah, the notion that they say monopolies are the only ones that create true wealth, right? Because competitions chip away profits, and that's why I think I keep emphasizing that as South Africa or as Africa, if we're trying to compete on a global scale, we're not going to win with the developed countries. We're not going to win with the countries that have reached efficiency levels we can only dream of already. We're not going to win with industries that have been established, that have infrastructure already, because we still have to invest. And pay back loans before we can even reap any benefits and returns. And I think the only way we can compete is by not competing and by creating monopolies for our own. I mean, we are, if we start realizing that we are the only ones who understand our markets the best, then we'll start realizing we can create monopolies for our own markets, and that's how we'll compete, or that's how we'll become, people to compete with for market share.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. No, I agree with you. Sorry, Bandile, do you mind muting yourself or somebody? So, I agree with you. And I do think that sometimes when we compare South Africa's global competitiveness and also just the state of our industries, we forget that, okay, number one, if you look at the history of, say, Silicon Valley, in fact, besides Silicon Valley, look at the history of the German manufacturing system. And, we used to praise German engineering a lot. We tend to forget that, a lot of the investments made in the German engineering sector, I guess manufacturing, came from the investments made in World War One. So basically, they were trying to make the economy ready for war, right? And at the same time, when you look at Silicon Valley, I mean, a lot of how Silicon Valley came about, there were many things involved, but a key intervention was government spending in the defense sector for World War II. And that's what created a lot of scientists that Silicon Valley then built its industry on. So South Africa never really had the same type of intentional spending, and I think I think war is a bad way to create an industry. I think there are better ways to create industries. So I'm not saying that the government should invest in war efforts, but I do think the government needs to be as intentional about spend. And you're right, Keisha. It's not necessarily about copying models from other parts, or not even just copying, but even trying to compete in spaces where we have very few advantages. But it's about solving our local issues and then and then of course becoming more and more competent and more competitive. Bandile?
Yes, so I think maybe what I'm getting at is the reasons why you value competition are spot on. It makes sure that people rationalize, that they think through. They have the forces that help them think through, how to use their resources more efficiently. But I don't think that it's right to think of countries competing with countries. I think it's a matter of, as countries, we allow for the space for a mix of competition amongst industries, right? So I don't expect, everyone to produce, things as efficiently all over the world, but there must be that mix of competition and coordination. Because I think if the current trends in 21st century late capitalism continue, that of just everyone rushing for profits without a more strategic thinking to say, well, if we hold back on profits, I think they will just things will converge in an unhealthy way. And there won't be that saying, okay, how do we balance all the human needs that need to be met sort of right now and in the future. So I do value competition, but my fear about competition, or mainly maybe my fear about 21st century late capitalism, the short-termism and the profit-seeking, like stops you from actually stepping back and making sure that real human needs are being met. And there's an economic argument for why human beings are being met. You want to run away from the morality, then it's like, well, there's the political consequences. As long as, that's assuming a situation where we value democracy. In a democratic context, if you're keeping people behind, you've got, basically there's that economic imperative to making sure that people's basic human and economic rights are upheld, and that people have a basic standard of prosperity, because you need them as future consumers, and you need them to be taken care of, so they don't create that political instability through pushing back. So for me, it's just saying, okay, what is at the higher level our levels of coordination, and is that coordination really benevolent, or is it looking after short-term interests? And then afterwards, when we say, okay, cool, these are the big goals we need to do, and this is how we can slice up the cake. Now, at a more micro level, let's have conditions that spur on competition. And I think, sorry to just go on a bit more, that's sort of the major lesson of the East Asian Tigers, right? And I'd say of the Nordic countries, because when you're having these debates at an ideological level, and you have leftist people, socialist type people saying, yeah, both the Nordic Scandinavian countries and the East Asian Tigers have had strong states. You have, capitalists saying, yeah, well, but East Asian Tigers and the Nordic countries had a lot of free market, and so China became more capitalist, even though it's only in name that they're communist. And what that mix actually is saying there's broad, clear, disciplined, high-level planning, and then in the details you say, okay, cool, we won't plan the economy right down to the bottom. At the bottom, we allow and we encourage competition that breeds efficiencies.
Yeah, well, here's an interesting implication, right? So, I guess to bring back the argument, I think the problem is how do you create any leading company or industry or country, right? And I think the word competition sometimes can be distracting. I think what might be a more appropriate term is, do you try and deterministically create a leading industry or country or a company, or do you do it probabilistically? If you do it probabilistically, it basically means you're going to take a bunch of bets and hope that one of them should pay off, So then the question is, how much competition is avoidable, right? Or how much competition is unavoidable in order to create like world-leading services, products, and technologies that can benefit many, many people. So here's a simple question. For a single business to create a world-leading business model, how many iterations should that business model go through? You know, there are many arguments that say, you know, it takes a couple of iterations, depending on the industry, right? If you look at technology, okay, in order to create a great company like Facebook, how many technology companies should the economy iterate through in order for a Facebook to emerge, right? And you've seen that a bunch of venture capitalists will compete, etc. And then you take it at a much more macro level, which is in order to create a world-leading software industry or full, for example, right? You know, how many different economies should be competing, and how many economies should the world iterate through in order to figure out which one is most efficient? So sometimes it isn't necessarily about competition, then it is about a gap in human knowledge to figure out what the best way forward is. And sometimes the only way to figure that out is to decentralize the process of experimentation in order to develop the best business model that should emerge from all of those experiments. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
Hey, yeah, so it does. There was a really fascinating article I read about China and how it echoes exactly what you're saying now about how the Chinese model, even you running such a large state and by extension running such a large economic project, what they get right is, you know, saying there's state control, but using the state apparatus to gather learnings and insights from all across the city, the system, right? So at your more micro local levels, you know, sort of maybe what's equivalent to their municipal level, they're given quite a bit of free range to try out different policies, to pilot things, and you know they try to reduce the bureaucracy at the very lowest level, to give different regions and different sort of more local government entities the room to try out different industrialization projects, try out working with different businesses, different models. And so, you know, you allow for failure and you allow for that decentralized process so different things can be tried. Then you use the state apparatus to evaluate, right? So it's not the market, quote unquote, evaluating progress, and it's not only, quote unquote, the markets that's developing these learnings, it's the state. And then the state can facilitate, you know, sort of the redistribution of these learnings and the application of these learnings at a higher macro level. So I think that's sort of spot on. In South Africa, though, I think we've got that problem of you know, the doers of things is usually the private sector, and then the regulators of things is sort of the state. And if you could have a more decentralized, so you can have a big state, but have it be more decentralized at the lower levels. And I mean, we're contending with obviously issues of corruption, inefficiency, and rent seeking and stuff like that. But if we were to have that cultural shift somehow, where you know you do allow for these iterations, I don't think it's possible to develop if you only allow for the learning and the risky sort of iteration and pivoting processes to happen only in the private sector. Because then it's only the private sector that's gaining the skills, and you don't have that spreading across the system.
You're right, and I think we saw this with the telco sector, which is we left them to their own devices, and after Telkom, a few iterations later, we end up with like Cell C, and we're like, well, you know, how special is this? Kehisha?
So I think we're onto something. So the notion of experimenting with different economic models and different business models for how to serve sectors. So one, it's already happening. We're just not seeing it as experimentation. We're seeing it as a high failure rate in businesses. And maybe the approach to research in the industry that's been triggered towards, you know, what's not there in the ecosystem. I remember the talk with Rob was all focused on, you know, what does not exist and what's required. Maybe the approach needs to start being, you know, every business that fails needs to be carefully tracked, and maybe that what needs to happen is more investment in tracking and in what monitoring and evaluation in the sector, so that eventually in 5 to 10 years we are better positions to say what works and what doesn't work. My biggest fear is, you know, big companies happening in the next 5 years in an ecosystem that doesn't work, and we can't tell why those companies worked. My biggest fear is companies continually failing and our high failure rates of businesses staying as high as it does, and we still don't have insights of why they've been failing. The second thing is, I like the notion of that Bandile is talking about decentralizing for the sake of, I think it was Khotso as well, decentralizing a lot of what the state controls. So it's a dangerous experiment, and I think because our state is so problematic already, it's low risk to do so now than it would be if we were established and we had systems that worked, right? So perfect example would be, you know, we spoke about the energy sector, and a perfect example would be to, you know, open up more to distribute energy distribution, like the right to distribute energy in the country to the private sector, and then start monitoring and tracking what private sector is doing, and seeing what works as a model for energy production, for energy distribution. And I think we could do this with a lot of industries, but as long as monitoring and evaluation is happening, and I think as long as our government structures become agile enough to respond to, you know, what's going on and what's wrong. And of course, human beings are exploitative in nature. Business is exploitative in nature. So I think carefully tracking what businesses are doing wrong or what businesses are doing right, or, you know, where the system's failing and where people are finding loopholes, and carefully building the systems and structures as the experiments continue. That would be progress.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think one of, you know, a huge psychological barrier, in fact, it stops being about psychology and then it starts being about life and death, is it's easier to iterate or to accept a failure rate as a result of multiple iterations at a micro level than at a macro level. So what that means is, if you're investing in a bunch of businesses that are supposed to create, you know, some interesting new, say, 3D technologies, and 99 of them fail and then one succeeds, and then all those investors sort of, you know, they get over it because they're betting on 20 other horses, so they're hoping to make up those losses. Then the problem is, when you iterate at a level, at a more macro level, like at a country level, people's lives get lost. So the costs are very high. So I think as much as it makes sense that we want to experiment, I think the costs are so high that it's just psychologically, it's just too difficult to get over that. You know, go ahead, Keisha.
Yeah. No, I like that. So I think we're not taking advantage of the fact that it's hard to say and it sucks, but we don't have much to lose. The majority of society does not have much to lose, right? Because poverty is just so high. And maybe
that's an interesting.
I know it's super controversial, but
you're right.
I think, like, my biggest fear is, and that's what you were saying to NK about our mindset, right? In this the supposed middle class growing, we could be stagnating the nation, because this middle class is growing in a system that does not work, and the middle class is gaining and gaining and gaining to the point where it's going to start fearing leaving, and it's going to start fearing you know, risking everything that it's gathered over the 5 to 10 years in organizations. And I know the foundation's got problems with us not being able to leave our jobs, but it's exactly that. There's a middle class that's being created in South Africa that is gaining assets, or the illusion of assets, and increasing our risk aversion. So, and I always think about foreigners, and we spoke, I don't know if we had spoken about it, but foreigners who come into a country have a very, very high business appetite, because when they leave their own countries, they almost come to SA and say, you know, I've got nothing to lose. I've left everything I could at home. I've got nothing to lose, and I'm willing to take whatever risk it takes.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean you saw what happened with the financial sector across the world when in the 80s companies were allowed to experiment with different financial products, and they took the financial engineering too far, and then that culminated in, you know, the 2008 financial crash. And as much as the financial crash sucks, there's no other way to actually figure out what the best financial system is. There's always going to be casualties, right? And not that those casualties are light. But you're right when you say, okay, we don't have anything to lose. Just psychologically speaking, when people saw what happened with the financial crash and so many people's livelihoods were affected, banks went down, jobs were lost, people died, you know, it's just so hard to actually overcome that mentally and psychologically, especially when health, death, and sickness is involved.
Sure.
It's tricky because also at the same we could argue that, oh, we could have invented a better banking system, like how we all sit down and agree and drink tea and then figure it out, you know. Wandile?
So I'm coming through, or rather, I've just, or what I'm reading right now. The person that's really fascinating me now is a guy called Nicholas Nassim Taleb, who wrote Anti-Fragile, and his whole big thing. He also wrote Black Swan, and his whole thing about skin in the game. I highly recommend you follow up on his work, Taleb. And yeah.
I like his work, but you know, I agree with him in terms of creating more anti-fragile systems. The problem, though, and I haven't read his book, the problem, though, is you can't avoid any casualties, and I do agree with him. Like, you know, technology sectors are examples of systems that are anti-fragile in that they benefit from chaos and disorder to create more value, right? And they become a bit stronger as a result of weathering that chaos. The problem is, how does society accept the casualties at a macro level in trying to create those systems? Because you still need to iterate to become anti-fragile. You can't do it deterministically.
Sure. So what are the sort of issues that we're dealing with, right? So, or rather, what are the risks we're not willing to take? Is it, say, in threats to human life, or like biological livelihood? So we don't like taking risks in health, or in when it comes to food systems or whatever. But say in employment, then we can take the risks, right? And then what you do to make the system more anti-fragile is to try as best as possible to isolate systems from each other, right? So you say, you sort of make it such that there are no macro repercussions. So if you say, look, we're trying to see if South Africa can really take off on, you know, developing some sort of solar energy or some farming technique, you limit the impact to a certain region, and you only try that thing in a certain region, and you make sure that the negative, the casualties don't spread. You design systems that the casualties don't spread further than that region, is the one thing he says. The other thing he says is that you make sure that the decision makers have skin in the game, right? That those who are making the decisions at the top actually have something to lose in how they design the system. So I think that's precisely, if he is correct, that's precisely the point. We don't like it for there to be these, there's no appetite, and I think that's correct, South Africa, there's no appetite for macro level casualties. So precisely what you do is that you design the system so that the iterations happen at micro levels, and so there's only local sort of casualties.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. Kihisha? Can go ahead.
I'm saying, let me hear what you've got to say first.
Oh, well, I mean, it's interesting that Bandile said that about being anti-fragile. I think the problem, though, is we sometimes forget that it's very difficult to isolate like the externalities that or repercussions that we can't necessarily predict. Earlier on, I mentioned that economies are a complex and chaotic system, which means a small change in inputs can have a major effect on outputs, what they call the butterfly effect. And an example of that is when they created innovative financial products in the 80s. Simple things like, swaps and options, which basically resulted in the crash of 2008. So sometimes you may try and limit something to a very specific region, but it's very difficult to actually predict how that innovation will spread and then what the consequences will be in future. So Kihisha, do you want to give a quick comment before I jump back to Bandile? All right, Bandile, do you want to quickly give a comment while we wait for Kihisha?
Oh, I didn't unmute
Okay,
myself, sorry. So I think you've just mentioned something, and I'm going to research further after this call, but I'm trying to figure out if there are economic models that were developed with the African view in mind and like no influence from the West. So like, yeah.
If you do find out, please let me know, because I'd love us to have a special class on this.
Okay.
A special EI class on this. I'd love that.
Yeah. Because
cool.
that systems are chaotic. Yeah, cool. Economies are chaotic, and that's why there's different theories, right? And I think chaos exists if models don't exist. And I think maybe that's just the key, like spending more time in modeling, not in cutting and pasting models that exist from the West, but in building models bottom up, like from scratch, based on insights, based on observations, as unbiased as can be, as with little influence from the West or from our experience of Western systems, but purely from where we are now, what the economy really is and how it really works.
Sure. Also, we should keep in mind that chaos isn't a thing that we're trying to avoid. It's inherent in the system. So biological systems are chaotic. Ecosystems are chaotic. Doctors who are trying to model how diseases spread across different regions are also dealing with chaotic systems. So it's not just economists, it's doctors, ecologists, etc., who've sort of got the same problem. It's interesting. Bandile, last comment before we close off.
Yeah, so I think, the whole issue about African economic models, perhaps in preparing for a chat on that, I'd like to know what we mean by economic models, and whether we think it's important that they have a characteristically African flavor. One. Two, sort of, what's the value add of it being born, of it coming from Africa? Maybe then it being an African model means it's come from Africa, okay, it's developed from insights unique to Africa. But then, sort of, is there a value add to that? What could it be? And where I sit on the issue is, I value the models or technologies or whatever. When we say they must be African, for me, the result matters more. And so it must be for Africans, it must work for Africans. more than it needs to come from Africa and be developed in Africa. Obviously, there's a link there. There will be some and probably significant likelihood that a system that's developed taking into account the dynamics of Africa will then lead to better results for Africa. But I think that the thing that should be the fixed point there should be it should just work for Africa. And so, you know, maybe you take these insights, you know, and in the thinking and in the preparation for a future chat, we go, okay, cool. How do we incorporate maybe the learnings from all over the world and, you know, apply them to Africa such that it works for Africa? Anyway, that's my provocation as we end off.
Sure. Thank you so much for your thoughts. And Bandile, I really like your idea about doing a bit more research on building anti-fragile systems. Sorry, Keisha, do you mind just keeping this super brief so we close off? And Marco, in fact, let's give Marco a chance. Marco hasn't said anything. Marco?
Hi, everyone. I got invited by Keisha, and yeah, I haven't really participated much in terms of contributing, but it's been a very, very interesting conversation. It's a great place to be. It's quite very, very interesting. The last bit that you brought up, it's very interesting to see the willingness for from everyone to actually explore more about finding African solutions to African problems. I think it's something that has been going on for quite some time. Thabo Mbeki has spoke about it a lot. I think Dr. Obasanjo, the former president of Nigeria, was into it a lot as well. I believe it's something that gave birth to the Africa Peer Review Mechanism, which was linked to NEPAD, some sort of a mechanism through which African leaders can hold each other accountable. And just reflecting on what Bandile was talking about, I think it'll be interesting. Obviously, I need to also do a bit of research so I can have a better contribution. But yeah, initiatives from Africa by Africans have been quite a challenging thing to implement because in most cases, as much as we may identify gaps, challenges, and as much as we may have solutions in mind that we believe can actually resolve our own problems, we heavily rely as a continent financially on funding from the Western world. So most African initiatives, even when you look at peacekeeping initiatives, are funded by maybe the UN, European Union. Trade initiatives are funded by the EU, and it's always the case that whoever is funding these initiatives is the one who have, you know, the most say in how they are implemented. So it comes off as a limiting factor. I think
Sure.
it's something we also need to look into.
Sorry, Marco. So I just want to make sure we don't, because we're already over time. So I'm actually going to ask you, if you don't mind. So you've mentioned some interesting pieces of research, especially about, you know, NEPAD and Thabo Mbeki and the African Peer Review Mechanism. If you do have some interesting things we can read, it'd be great if you could email us, email me specifically.
Okay.
Also, because in 2 sessions' time, we'll be discussing, you saw how today we discussed growth in South Africa. We'll be discussing Africa's economic growth. So I'd really like to take this conversation further. I hope you can join us for the next sessions as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it'll be a pleasure.
Thank you. And just 2 announcements as well is, so the next class, which is happening next week, so sorry about having these 1 week apart. I know it's ideal to have them 2 weeks apart, but you know, we had to reschedule for the guest speaker, and then the guest speaker wasn't able to make it today. So next week we're going to have Swati Martin join us, and she is one of Africa's top luxury entrepreneurs. And the big topic is going to be about how to create solutions for yourself before you create them for society. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us. We really appreciate all your thoughts. And Bandile and Kihisha, don't forget to send through any links just regarding, reinventing Africa in a different way. I'd really like to have a very separate segment for this in the next discussion, which is in two classes' time. So the next class is with Swati. The one after that will be about Africa. And then Rachel should be back in the next class. So sorry she couldn't make it today. She should be back soon for the next class.
Thanks, Hoto. Thanks, Bandile.
Thank you so much, folks. Have a good evening and chat soon.
Awesome.
All right,
Just
sure.
a question. Are we on? So next one is this module 5, right?
Sorry, I forget the numbers. Give me a quick
This
second.
was module 4.
Yeah.
And so
And
next week is a guest speaker, and then the week after that is module 5.
Oh, when there's a guest speaker, it's not a module. Okay.
Yeah, in fact, to be just to clarify, so this was module 4, as Bandile said. Next week we decided to switch them up. Next week is module 6, solutions for one.
Okay.
The reason why we switched them up is because we're solving for the calendar of the guest speaker. We'd rather have the guest speaker. We'd rather switch a session and have a guest speaker than keep the sessions the same and not accommodate the guest speaker.
Okay.
Sure.
And then we'll have module 5 after module 6.
Awesome.
Sure.
The Africa
Sure.
module. Cool. Have
All
a
right,
good
cool.
one.
Sure.
That's it.
Thanks, guys.